Welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Kermit Whitfield, a member of CMC's Board of Trustees and AVP of Communications at United Way of Central Ohio. It's great to see everyone here today. Today's CMC Forum, Megalopolis 2050, Building Tall, is sponsored by Corner Kokosing Dugan Myers, Taft, Palmetto Construction Services, Easton Community Foundation, Steiner Associates, Frost Brown Todd, and CASTO. Each of our sponsors are represented here by many friends and associates. Please help me thank them. This week, we are excited to explore the potential future of Columbus, suggesting rapid growth, more tall buildings, and increasing density. While it is easy to be excited about our dynamic future, we can't overlook important questions of how growth will affect neighborhoods, affordability of housing, transportation, and land use. Let's hear from our experts. Please welcome Design Principal at NBBJ, Daniel Ayars, Founder and CEO of Steiner Associates, Yaromir Steiner, Director of Planning and Environment at MORPC, Kerstin Carr, and our host today, Director of the Department of Development for the City of Columbus, Steve Schoeny. Steve, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you all for coming today. This is a very exciting topic and very pertinent to us. When the opportunity to moderate this panel came up for me, I was very excited about it because this gave me the chance to ask someone else questions that everybody keeps asking me. So in the spirit of that, I will do my best to be a moderator and not a panelist. However, I do reserve the right and actually will be correcting the panelists when they get it wrong. And as a fan of sports talk shows, I will actually be giving them points on their answers, and the winner at the end of the day gets one of those. I was going to say infamous. I meant famous CMC T-shirts. CMC didn't know they were going to have to supply an extra T-shirt, and they didn't get like the extra tall version for Dan. So I don't know whether if Dan wins or not, it's going to be acceptable. So without any further ado, I'm actually just going to go ahead and launch into some questions for our panelists, and I'm going to start with Kerstin. Kerstin, why is Columbus continuing to grow at the pace it is when you look around us and you see our neighboring cities in the state not growing at the same pace or not growing at all and still continuing to shrink? What is kind of the secret sauce for us going forward?
Thank you, Steve. That's a really great question, and good afternoon, everyone. Really excited to be on this panel here, sitting between these two wonderful young men. That's a great question. I actually just read a statistic on MSN saying, fastest growing MSAs per state, and Columbus was, of course, rated as the fastest growing city within Ohio. Between 2010 and 2017, the Columbus metropolitan area grew by 172,000 people, whereas the state of Ohio only grew by 119,000 people, which means that overall Ohio, the rest of Ohio has been losing population. So that's a big deal, and it's a lot to carry on Columbus's shoulders as well. But why is that Columbus is successful in still growing its economy and its residences? And I think, some of the easy answers are, we are the state capital. We have a lot of the state governments here. We have really strong headquarters. And then, of course, OSU and some of the higher educational systems are great as well. So fundamentally, we are really different from a lot of the other cities around Ohio because we are very service-based rather than goods-based. And it's setting us up to be more resilient as an economy overall. But then on another spectrum, I think we also have very strong regional and community leadership, thanks to you guys in the room and many on the panel here that have foresight, and they are being proactive in terms of listening to the market trends and planning of what is needed and what people want.
Anything to add?
No, I think it's an interesting question because it does It shines a light on Columbus. I think a number of the success stories that we've had over the last, between Smart Columbus, a lot of short lists on a number of different, people are looking at Columbus from the outside and starting to see, I think, some of that secret sauce that's coming in. And I think it is driving people to find out more. But the city is well positioned in many ways because of the infrastructure that's here and the leadership that's set it up for that. The question's going to be now, how do we move that forward, and do we do the right things moving it forward for both the city and for the larger region?
I think one of the reasons why Columbus is ahead of everybody else is because 2 of the 4 panelists speak with an accent. And
I can try.
So actually, part of the reason we put Kerstin on the panel was so that Yaromir would have to change his normal joke about how he gets to say whatever he wants because he has a foreign accent. So that was part of Kerstin's role, and I'll actually give you 10 bonus points for adjusting the joke.
No, but more seriously, though, I mean, that's a symbol of the openness, a sign of the openness of Columbus. The Columbus way is not just a reputation, it's real. The public-private cooperation, the fact that we all work together to make our city a better place, I think is one of our bigger strengths. And that makes the city welcoming to everyone. I mean, I came here 20 years ago, now it's home. And I think many people feel the same way. I would just one anecdote. We have Wizard of Oz at Easton. The girls who are running that show came from Miami, Florida. They were young women acting as the ushers and managing the thing. When the program ended about a few weeks ago, they told us how sad they were to go back. They said it's so good to work here. I have my people here who are shaking their heads. I mean, these people, I mean, they were here in the middle of winter, right? January, February, March, and they were regretting going back. They said people are so friendly, it's so easy to live here. And I think that's what makes Columbus a great place.
You left April out of your months of winter. So one of the questions, so we're seeing all this growth, and one of the questions that I consistently get is, why aren't we seeing more tall buildings? Why are we topping out at 6 stories or 12 stories? I'm going to turn that to the architect and say, Daniel, why are we not? What's the difference between a 6-story building and a 12-story building and a 50-story building?
Yeah, if you read Columbus Underground a lot and read the any of the comments on any of the new proposals out there, it's never tall enough. Why is it so short? Why is it going down in height? And it's a tough thing to look at from an architecture side. There's actually a number of pieces to it that are just pure code related, and the code is for safety, and that safety then starts to drive up cost as you start to get into higher heights. So 4 stories, your structural systems can be fairly simple. You have a lot of options. As you get into taller, so take 250 High Street, there's a steel structure, it has residence in it, it has office, and it's got up to 12 floors. We studied a number of options going to 17 on 80 on the Commons, but the price, once you get over that height limit, over about 125 feet, the code changes, and that starts to add costs that you guys will never see, but is there for your safety. So how do you start to provide the height, provide the opportunities for best utilization of the land in a downtown area? It really does become an issue of that. And things that drive a lot of it is also parking. So each one of those aspects starts to drive how high you can go and what are the opportunities within each project. But I do want to make one clarification. The 3 panelists here, we may have 2 with accents, but all 3 of us have at least lived overseas.
That's true. Indeed.
I can be included. I was able to live in Shanghai for 5.5 years. So.
I lived in Canada. I guess that doesn't really count.
All right, we all are.
Anybody have anything to add to that answer?
I think, I mean, what I would say, the reason we don't build vertical is because we don't need to. Right now, there's no incentive to do it. And also the infrastructure, I mean, the permitting process for tall buildings outside downtown, is horrendously complicated. I mean, the neighborhood commissions and all those rules. And we don't have significant reliable transit system to get rid of some of the cars needed for vertical buildings.
Yeah, one of my standard responses to that question is we can afford, in Columbus, you can afford to do one of two things. You can afford to build parking, or you can afford to go taller. You can't afford to do both. Our rents aren't at that point. The realization that you get on a building, and when you add, let's call it a minimum of $20,000 a space, up to $35,000, $40,000 a space, that really is one of the limiters to that. So, Kerstin, with the, and I'm going off script, so which is my right as the moderator. As you and your colleagues at MORPC look at the impact of cars and storing cars on the development of the city, what kinds of things do you see moving forward? What are the opportunities that you see with Smart Columbus and with the corridor study that we're doing and those kinds of things?
Yeah, so the corridor study that Steve is referring to is called Inside 2050 Corridor Concepts, and we're basically looking at 5 regional corridors within Central Ohio and looking at different development patterns along these corridors and different type of uses and density levels and what those development patterns mean in terms of metrics such as energy use, traffic, fiscal budgets, and so forth, very similar to what we've done overall with Inside 2050. But one thing that we're adding to this element is actually thinking about what type of development pattern along these corridors makes sense to support high-capacity transit. And we're purposefully are not predetermining what the technology of high-capacity transit is. We just know it will need dedicated right-of-way to truly be high-capacity transit, but it could be light rail, it could be bus rapid transit, it could be any kind of new technology that's coming out with AV, potentially bus platooning, or it could be a mix of all kinds of mobility options. And so the partnership with Smart Columbus is really helpful in that regard to have these conversations about transportation in general. And here are a lot of these partners in the room that are involved in Inside 2050. In fact, Yaromir Steiner is the co-chair of that corridor concept study, and then Council President Hardin is the other co-chair, and both were really instrumental for the study to even happen. The study goes a bit further than we did with Inside 2050. It actually says at the end of the day, let's decide what is a preferred scenario that we want to select and what kind of changes need to be happening in terms of policies, workforce housing, zoning codes, and so forth. So it's a really exciting time to kind of look at these different mobility options in concert with land use as well.
You know, what I would like to also say is that when you look at those corridors, we only picked 5 corridors as an example, and they represent only maybe a third of all the corridors. We already know that by just slightly densifying them, almost we can absorb, 700,000-800,000 people on those corridors without taking any green space beyond our limits. So this study is real important. And when it comes to densities, the way we need to think, including the tall buildings, the biggest problem we have right now, and I'm sure you're going to support me on this, is that we are building 4-story buildings on land that should be 20-story building land. And then it becomes, then later when we finally say, okay, now it's time, then unfortunately most of the land is taken and the cost of bringing them back gets more difficult. So on the transit corridors, for example, when we will build apartments, there's not going to be a requirement like in our existing code right now that he's in charge of, 2 parking spaces, per apartment in neighborhoods where half the people don't have cars. And then, instead, it's going to be a new code on the corridors going to say maximum amount of parking provided is 1/2 car per apartment, and the vertical buildings should be the same way. When instead of selling downtown, you can build anything, you have to say, if you don't build minimum 20 stories, you have to pay a penalty. We need to densify by planning and by regulation.
As usual, Yaromir is stating opinion is fact. Just to be clear, that is not an endorsement of new city policy. Actually, it's Building and Zoning Services that oversees that stuff. I don't have oversight over that. And we have not released a plan that says we're going to do away with height densities along these corridors. So, however, the concepts that he's outlining are certainly things that we're looking at. I thought being the moderator would get me out of having to say some of that, and then I remembered Yaromir's on the panel. Sorry. did you want to add anything?
There's two interesting scenarios with that. Is when you do look at the land that we have downtown, we look at the corridors that start to go out, and there's opportunities in both, I think, to densify those. And I think some of the things that we do need to look at is we need that bigger understanding of what that impact is. I know when we were looking at some buildings on High Street, as we got closer to university, they've actually dropped the height limit, which then starts to limit us. And so there's times I think the city and everybody's looking to move us forward and really want to get to that, but we keep trying to somehow come back and undercut and don't allow ourselves the ability to really allow these corridors to perform the way that they're supposed to perform. Or in downtown, taking advantage of, if we did build all 5-story buildings across all the open land we have now, and then suddenly we have an influx of need of office space, which when you look at that skyline, which is actually quite interesting, it's about 25, 30 years old. Those office buildings downtown, the office space is getting old. It's not performing the way that it needs to for companies that are coming in. It's not the right office space yet, and we're at about, 14% vacancy? Yeah. So we don't have enough office tenants to help support building a new office building, which is what you need to help drive up rents, which all of that ties into new construction, which has some major cost impacts also.
So one thing that I would say to this whole conversation, it's really, in rooms like this, it's really easy to stand here and talk as though we're playing SimCity and we get to program whatever size buildings we want. But one of the things I've learned over the last 5 years of being in this job is that people live there, and they live there today. And one of the most important things we need to do, and which is part of why I love having these conversations, but more importantly, having conversations outside of downtown, is that we need to have a genuine engagement with folks in the neighborhoods that are along these commercial corridors that can, should, and I think will see explosive growth, because it has a lot of implications for those neighborhoods. We just last week had 12 experts from around the country in for an exercise that Urban Land Institute and National League of Cities do called the Rose Fellowship, where they spent the whole week on essentially the Near East Side and kind of Southeast Side, looking at a corridor and saying, how do we get ahead of what we believe is the challenges that are coming and make sure that it lifts up a neighborhood and lifts up the people in the neighborhood and doesn't overwhelm them. I forget who it was, and I'm sure it's actually probably somebody in this room, because I talked to a lot of you, reminded me of, a rising tide lifts all boats except for those that have an anchor. And those boats get swamped. And we need to make sure that we're addressing that issue. So after that downer, so let's, go ahead. So let me throw out a hypothetical. So let's say that there's a really big company that wanted to bring, I don't know, tens of thousands of jobs to the city. What excites you about that, and what scares the heck out of you about it?
It's actually it's an interesting discussion. I lived in Seattle for a number of years and watched actually different companies go through different growth there. So you take somebody like Microsoft, moved out to the suburbs, built a campus, low, flat, spread out. You had Boeing that ended up moving to a whole nother city. And then you had Amazon in downtown Seattle, who wanted to build up everything in South Lake Union. If anybody knows Seattle, it's a lower rise, there's neighborhoods, it's a nice area. They built up a lot of their office, and they thought that would be enough for probably 10 to 15 years. They were done in about 3. And they took over that area, and they realized that they really enjoyed that urban area and that urban space that their employees could use, and that was their differentiator that they really took advantage of that urban environment they didn't have to build it, it was there, they were able to take advantage of it, and that's why they then built 3 massive high-rises in downtown, in the center, and not the easiest place to build, probably the hardest, but it provided them the ability to recruit people to that area. So fast forward to where we're at today, and you look at a city which everybody knows we've been shortlisted. We're shortlisted on 20 cities for Amazon, and go, what does that mean? What does 50,000 employees in the city? What does all of that mean to us long term? And when you look at the total area that they proposed in the original RFP, which is all public, is 8 million square feet. Well, right now in downtown, we have about 6 million square feet. So you're doubling the city. So what does that mean? How do you deal with that? Well, we're at a point in time where we actually have a lot of land. We have a lot of opportunity in the city to really drive it forward. To me, it's exciting. It would be growth that would put Columbus on the map. I know it scares the heck out of a lot of people. I see a ton of downsides to where it would have a big impact on the city, but I actually think there'd be higher long-term growth opportunities for a city not on a coast that could have a major entity and a major development and could become a catalyst example for a number of the other cities to grow. So my hope is, in the end, they end up picking somewhere around there.
I think the thing that excites me most about getting a company like Amazon to locate here is that it will really help elevate the discussion and the funding around quality of life amenities. We know, and we've learned over the last few years, that previously people followed jobs wherever they were. It's completely reversed now. Jobs are following where the people are, and the people want to be in communities that have these certain quality of life amenities, such as trails and walkable communities, active river access, good nightlife. And so getting companies like this to locate here really will help spur that. On a completely different spectrum, I've also recently read that a lot of young professionals are more motivated by their work being purpose-driven and impactful rather than money and career. And so I think there's also a huge advantage that Columbus and the area has here because of their really strong nonprofit world and arts culture, and getting young professionals to Columbus and really getting involved in the community and giving back can also be a huge driver for us here locally.
Yeah, my comment, we at ULI, are concerned about the growth of Columbus with or without Amazon, and we are looking to peer cities who went through the same problem. And the 3 cities we picked was Charlotte, Nashville, and Austin. And we build relationship with our ULI peers and then people from those cities and learning lessons from about the things not to do. But one of the problems of Austin, for example, is the single axis of development, with most of the jobs being concentrated in the middle, create an absolute nightmare for transportation and for affordability of housing. And one of the strengths of Columbus is our radial design, right? I mean, we go in all directions. And the fact that we have neighborhoods who are sometimes autosufficient. I mean, things are happening at Polaris, who are, people live there, work there. There are things happening in New Albany. There are things happening in Dublin and so forth. So one of the biggest concerns I have about all those people coming in and going to one location is going to be all the nightmare it's going to create. And we need to be forward-thinking. So we provide, lodging, living, quality of life, in neighborhoods, so people don't have to, work downtown and then have to commute up to, Reynoldsburg or someone, where it's difficult. And that's going to be our strength. Become a city of villages from Worthington to Dublin to Bexley, et cetera, where we try to create communities who are complete, where you can live there from birth to death and you can work there as well.
So I'm answering my own question because I'm the moderator and I have the privilege of doing that. I think for me and how we've looked at it at the city is pretty simple. The growth is coming whether it comes from one company or whether it comes from 500 companies. We honestly believe, and if you look at the work that ULI and MORPC did on Insight 2050, we believe that we are going to, over the next 20 to 30 years, see that kind of growth in the city. And so we have to be prepared to deal with the issues of housing affordability, strain on our schools, strain on our institutions, one way or the other. And so that's why we're moving forward on things like our change in our incentives policy. That's why we're moving forward on things like bringing the Rose Center in to do this study on our housing policies primarily. And we have to do it whether we have a company like Amazon or not. What the Amazon opportunity presents is the opportunity to really have a partner to work with versus having to marshal 50 to 500 partners to work with. And so from a ability to shape the change, it's a unique opportunity to be able to shape the change that we believe is coming one way or the other. A couple more questions, and then we'll move to audience questions. And actually, I'll just finish with one more audience question, or one more question for me before we go to audience questions. So give me give me in the audience an example of where you think high density, really high density has been done really well, and give us an example where it's been done really poorly. And if you're out there in the audience, feel free to get out your phone. This is a chance to actually look like you're doing what we're telling you to do while you're checking your email if you don't really want to look up the projects we're talking about. But give us some examples of some places where you think it's been done well and where it's not. And please keep them in North America unless you guys all want to show off your international chops and make me feel bad for only having lived in Toronto.
I guess it's an interesting question on whether anybody has really done it well or not. Each of the cities, and I know them best of different cities that I've lived in, and I know they've approached it in different ways. What's kind of interesting is how each of the cities has grown, which is to Yaromir's point. And some cities, the geography has such an impact in many respects that it really impacts how the city works, how it functions. You take like a Seattle is very north-south. You take this, Columbus is very radial, to Yaromir's point. The ones that I think have done the best job have embraced the mass transit or survived the changeover of mass transit and kept it as part of the city fabric that has allowed the city to continue to function, I think, at a higher level than cities that, a lot of their trolley systems and everything went away. And we're just in the process of many cities bringing that back, or in the case of Columbus, the need to bring in some of the next levels of transportation. The building infrastructure has a piece of that it's hard to really know how much a city has a better building stock, which allows them to retain people and living there. So like Detroit, people have moved out, right? So some of those cities have been a case of an economy affecting it. I don't really know if I know of, within the U.S. I just know that the cities that I've lived in that the mass transit has worked the best, I've enjoyed living in the most.
The city I would mention, North America, you said, you not say U.S.
Yeah,
Toronto would be a good example. I mean, Toronto is a city, lots of verticality, but not everywhere. I mean, there are home neighborhoods mixed with high-rise neighborhoods, and high-rise neighborhoods are along the lake, but also on the northern suburbs and on the east, on the west. And obviously a very solid, transit system who connects all those hubs together. I think the key, to successfully create dense cities is transit. And again, I'm not going to confuse facts from opinions, but it's not going to be transit like we know it, on rails or on trolleys and so forth. It's going to be somehow, autonomous and maybe electric, kind of systems, maybe on demand, artificial intelligence. And I hope Columbus will be the first city to implement, of a certain size, to implement those kind of technologies. So transit is important. And the second thing is a comprehensive planning of the region. In Canada, the province plans. It's not just the city. So we need to be able to plan at a global level, then we can make decisions more effectively about how to densify.
I think the city that comes to mind that I like a lot is Chicago. And one, it functions really well, but also aesthetically, I like the mix of modern architecture and the preservation of historic buildings. And I like that we are doing that in Columbus already as well with the Levesque Tower and the Citizens Bank building, and I hope that's something that we continue to have here. But also downtown, I wanted to bring that fact up because a few weeks back, the CMC had a State of the Downtown discussion here, and we heard that downtown residential population right now is at 8,400 people, and people are still very worried about the density and the intensity that comes with density. But back in the 50s or 60s, that population was up at almost 40,000 people in downtown Columbus. So there's a lot of room for us to grow up back to those original levels, but we need to make sure that we do it right. As Yaromir said, make sure that we have that we are strategic about making sure that transit can support it, that we have the right amenities in place to really make it a functional and fun neighborhood to be in.
Great. Well, this is the point in the program where we move to audience questions. So if you have a question, there's a microphone right over there. Stand up, start moving that way. It is CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please state your name, ask your question, and in consideration of everyone, please stick to your question rather than editorial comments. So we have our first question.
Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Fox. I attended that ULI program last week, and one of the speakers mentioned that the affordability of housing is also related to transportation. And my question is a chicken and egg question. So we have lots of neighborhoods that are densifying. We don't necessarily have the transit that will get people to their jobs, and we don't necessarily have housing in the areas of jobs in all cases. So what comes first and maybe it's more than a chicken and an egg, transit that will get people to their jobs, housing affordability combined with transportation affordability, and densifying, which requires fewer cars?
The answer is yes. But I'll let the panelists try and give a more serious answer.
Yeah, I think a couple years ago, a report came out that basically stated that there was a lack of 55,000 affordable housing units within Franklin County. And in reality, it's not that we don't have enough well, we might lack some, but it's not necessarily that we don't have 55,000 homes that can support affordable housing, but we don't have them in the right places, right? So it's either they're unsafe, they're away from other transportation options and so forth. And you bring up the affordability between housing and transportation, and anything over 45% of income is considered housing and transportation cost burdened. And I have some statistics here for all of our counties, and we're all above that burden. So we have to get better at really thinking about mobility options and bringing homes closer to transit corridors and other corridors as well to make affordable housing work. It's one of my concerns. You guys have any?
So the other thing that I would add is you're right, it's all interrelated. I don't think you can address one without the other, but one of the keys is part of making it more affordable to live in Columbus isn't just rent, it's the affordability of transportation. And the more that we can do to move toward a more effective mass transit system, because CODA is really effective for a lot of people, but we need it to be more effective for more people.
I mean, I would like to go to real numbers from Kerstin's sheet. In Delaware County, for example, housing plus transportation cost as an average is 65%, should be 45%. And the best number is Franklin County, where we are at 47% instead of 45%. And then the other counties are around 50, basically.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is John McKnight. I work with Rife's Auto Body here in Columbus. Another money question or affordability question. So part of what makes Columbus attractive to big businesses or small businesses that want to come into the area is our thriving economy, which is connected to the affordability of living and doing business in Columbus. And that connects to low unemployment and to the near capacity of the vacant space that we have. Yet it seems like what I heard is that by going up, we're going to be, we're looking to raise rents to be able to afford to move upward, significantly raising them. Isn't that going to kind of jack all the other stuff up.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to it is the previous comment, right? I mean, affordability is the adding the cost of transportation plus the cost of housing. To be, I mean, totally light and silly about it, if you are working downtown and you have an apartment downtown and the rent is even much higher than you were paying before, but you don't have to own a car and you can use your C-Bus, to go to work. That's
Hey, Yaromir, remember you're talking to somebody from Rife's Auto Body Shop, so just be careful about being too anti-car on that.
More cars. So maybe another element of the question is what's it going to do to the ones of us that aren't in the point in our life where we're looking to, to move into these areas and, and live and work and grow there. I'm in the, stage of my career where I'm looking at slowly phasing out of work and living where I'm at in an affordable area, an affordable, thriving economy and all of that. Is it going to make my life more expensive and kind of mess up my financial plan?
Well, I mean, ideal for you, I mean, it would be, I mean, if you're still in the working years of your life, I mean, still working, I mean, it would be organizing our city in such a way that maybe your work is close to where you live.
A couple other things I would say. Number one is it is about having a portfolio of housing options. It's about making sure that we're able to do density so we can support the transit options. But the other thing that we're finding is as preferences change, you have to have a supply side strategy as well. So the preference for urban living is a fundamental demographic shift that I don't think is going anywhere. And so what happens in those situations is if you're not producing more housing at the upper ends, the folks with the money will get what they want in terms of their location, and they'll push others out. So one of the strategies that we're looking really hard at is how do we really focus on mixed income developments? So allow for the density, but as we have density, require there to be an affordable mixed income element to it so that you get the best of both worlds, so that you have some affordability in your projects. It's a really complex question, and it's really all about the economics of construction costs and all these things, but there are some things that we're looking at to not only encourage higher cost, higher density, but as a requirement for having the ability to do that, you also got to provide some affordability in your projects. Mr. Brown?
Thank you, Steve. Eric Brown, and resident of Short North, and occasionally do some things with Columbus City Schools. Couple of questions that I wanted to ask, and your comment, Steve, to our friend from Rife's helps focus that. The panel, for the most part, works in this industry, much like Rife's is in the business of dealing with cars and happy to see more cars. Those of you on the panel are in the business of designing and building buildings, especially high-rises, which present even more interesting challenges for you. And you're all, as I heard it anyway, assuming that going higher has virtue, that growing larger has virtue. I do understand that demographics tell us that we're going to be growing to some extent no matter what we do. But many of the measures that you're describing are really designed to encourage even greater growth and then to have to go higher. What is the virtue for all the rest of us that are not specifically in your industry to go higher, get more dense, have greater crowds, and some of the other things that come along with it? The second question.
Hold on, let's let them answer the first question. And then.
Okay.
Eric, first, there's only one person who builds high-rise here, and that's him. She doesn't build anything. I've never built a high-rise, and I don't think he builds anything either. No. Yeah, so.
what are you saying?
The second thing is, I was concerned about the subject of this meeting when it started about tall buildings, because it's not really about tall buildings. It's about densification. And densification can happen with tall buildings sometimes. To give you an idea, when we did the Inside 2050 study, do you know what was the definition of dense? It was 6 units per acre. That's less than Italian village, less than the German village. So there is degrees of density, and I think the conversation should be more about gradual densification. Yes, downtown there'll be some high rises, but we're not talking about putting high rises everywhere. To give you an idea, the 5 transit corridors, and because I was privy to these numbers early, the 5 transit corridors who represent a third of all the transit corridors, and the transit corridors who represent less than half of the available land, those 5 transit corridors, if you can go to 20 units per acre, which is not, I mean, it's an apartment project, low-density apartment project, you could take 60% of the future growth of Columbus. That's it. So, I mean, imagine that's only half the, I mean, a third of the corridors, and corridors on. So, I mean, we are not talking about densifying Columbus. We are talking about densifying sections of it. You know, I mean, these 50,000 people can fit on the peninsula, basically, in plus or minus, I mean, for work. I mean, it's not like, you know, we need to, you know, build a forest of buildings. I mean, I want to correct that because we talk about height, and that's not about height. That's about intelligent densification.
Yeah, I think the interesting part around building tall in each of the cities as they go through their growth, one of the concerns I have in a city like Columbus with the history, and when you look at a map, there was a huge building boom in at a chart, 80s big building boom, high-rise downtown, and it's been stagnant for now, again, 30 years. There's a chance that we could start building again on the peninsula now because they've been able to put the wall, you know, the levee, and there's an opportunity there. There's a lot of land. If you start building all low-rise, let's just say we stick to 6 stories and we kind of build out the city that way, the challenge will become the use of land is going to then, it's going to drive us to it. So take London, years and years of low growth, tight growth, really tight, really dense, and then now they're starting to build up tall. There's not enough land left. So I think we're at a point in time that the city has to make a decision on where those areas need to be focused for that density, for that growth in height. And tall towers. But I think we also have a moment that we're looking at our building stock and saying, is it still supporting the city in the long term? Or is it going to start dating itself to where companies aren't going to move here? Growth stagnates, starts to have a bigger effect on the overall region. So it's an interesting puzzle of all these different pieces, because if we don't have those companies that are maybe in these taller towers, then they're spreading out over larger areas, and we're driving more, or we're relying on mass transit to solve those problems versus, I believe, an idea of bringing people to more of a center and not spreading them out over and sprawling over a larger area.
Okay. Did you have a short follow-up?
Yes, it is a short, different question,
okay.
But you touched on it just a few moments ago, and that is gentrification. And the concern about neighborhoods like mine, Short North, where a lot of the lower income folks have been driven out, have been priced out. The smaller businesses and independent shops have been priced out to a great extent because of some of the development. How do you do it differently so that you can retain, have affordable housing and retain a mix of economic spectrum?
The short answer is, we don't entirely know yet, but we're working to figure it out. I mean, that was the whole purpose of the Rose Fellowship study group coming in. And it is, you know, look, the Short North is great. It's fantastic. It is a national model for how to turn a neighborhood around in some aspects, but it has not been an unmitigated success. So, David.
Hi, folks. David Chesbrough, former president and CEO at COSI. And now I've been out of my position for a little bit over a year, so I'm a little bit unplugged, but there's a lot of people in this room, and 2 of you mentioned the peninsula. Since that is almost a blank slate right near the heart of downtown, what out of the plans that we have now or the projects that are going on, I know represented by some of the folks in this room, what's working well so far that you can see? What may be warning signs based on the kind of conversation points we've had today? Thank you.
It's interesting. We've studied the peninsula in many different ways, trying to see what are the best opportunities. And you take the example of Chicago, and they built right up against the riverfronts, right? You put that density right up on a river, and it has its pluses and it has its minuses. Some of the peninsula pieces that I look at, it's like it's pulled off the river, creates the green space there, but it also pulls you further away and creates a bigger divide from the major downtown core and the peninsula. So those are problems that are there. I don't necessarily have solutions for it. But how do you, my long-term concern there is that we end up just kind of making it a low-rise area that is almost considered more of a suburb of the downtown versus reverting it back to its history, which was the center of the city was for Columbus in Franklinton. It was and the peninsula was the heart of the city until it moved to the other side. So how do you allow it to become a plus for the city, and we don't lose that opportunity of this blank slate? Because there are very few cities in the U.S. that have that much land next to the downtown that has so much potential. And the challenge for the city and all the developers is, how do you not mess it up?
And the one thing I would say that we figured out, and this is somewhat to Mr. Brown's question, whatever we do on the residential side, we're going to require some level of mixed income in it. And that's a fundamental policy tenet for what we're doing. We don't know what the details are going to be right now. We started down that path first with CASTO's project, which is coming along really nicely. There. That was not, I would have made that comment even if there wasn't a whole table from CASTO here. Their project's coming out of the room really nicely. Kaufman's project, we did the same thing with Kaufman's project on the north end. That's not technically the peninsula, but a lot of people, that line is blurring a lot. So we have time for one more question. Joanne Goldhand gets the opportunity to ask that question. So Joanne, go ahead.
Yeah, and Joanne has changed her mind on what that question should be about 4 times while I've been standing here. What you said about, Yaromir, about density not being high rises every single time is exactly right. And we seem to have lost that a little bit in the short north. What brought people there is what Kerstin described. The great architecture made an ability for the resurrection of a neighborhood. It was a draw. Those buildings lasted already hundreds of years, or 117 years for my house. And we are, ignoring those qualities by if we only build up, and if we build up very high into the neighborhood, because it just loses all of the specialness about it. So I'm wondering if you say it's a model for the rest of the city, I'm wondering where we are trying to push some of that development and help things to replicate that and to save what we need to save in the short north.
So what I said is it's looked at by some as a model for other developments. And then I'll let the panel answer. It's nothing, I don't ever think anything should ever be replicated. Everything has to have its own unique spin. There are some things that went well. You're in the short north is no longer a red light district. But that's generally looked at as a good thing. But it has not. And one of the things that I've been most struck by when we looked at the data is in 2000, the median household income in the short north and in Linden were the same. And there's good and there's bad that's a change. It's not something that is without a cost. Some people have been moved out of the neighborhood. But I think if we went back in time and said, is the short north better today than it was in 2000? or in 1995, the answer would be yes. Are there things we would do differently? What are the lessons we've learned? That's the question we're constantly asking ourselves. So the question we're constantly asking ourselves is what would we do differently from an affordability standpoint, and how would we manage the density better?
I think one of the interesting things to that point, German Village, Short North, those are the areas that really help Columbus become unique in its places. Many cities don't have those opportunities, and I think that Columbus has taken advantage of those. The next level is, okay, what's the challenge for the developers in the future and the city to make sure that when we do start to look at areas around town, that we are taking the best opportunity for the long term, whether that's density and tall towers, or not just the short-term gains and where we're at today. And I know a lot of the things that are driving us out there now are construction costs and rents, and those in Columbus today don't match. And that's one of the things that I think is the long-term hurdle for Columbus, to understand how you are going to have to raise the rents, because construction costs have continued to skyrocket, but rents have stayed flat. So how do you build a new building? How do you start to balance that out when rents here do not spike like other cities? And all of those pieces end up defining whether a Short North needs to go up higher or can stay lower rise, where those corridors are in the transit. But I think, from my mind, the low-income housing and ability of the city to really embrace the next 100 years, not the next 20 years with our building.
So I know we're out of time, so one last comment. So I added up my totals on points here, and we came out with a dead tie only because Yaromir changed his joke at the beginning, and that's what pulled him up, was his bonus points. So thank you from me to the panel.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for keeping track there. I guess we got to cough up a T-shirt now. Or 3 T-shirts. Wow. All right. We got to look at the budget on that. All right. I hope you enjoyed today's forum. Everybody, I know I did. And we encourage you to continue the conversation with coffee and cookies, as is our tradition. You can view and share today's forum on all of our forums on CTV, Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel, and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. Please help me thank our sponsors, and I have to apologize because we missed a sponsor, and it's a new sponsor at the beginning of the program, so I want to make up for that now. Jazernak Gears, Cornucocosing Dugan Myers, Taft, Palmetto Construction Services, Easton Community Foundation, Steiner Associates, Frost Brown Todd, and CASTO. And let's thank our speakers, Daniel Ayars, Yaromir Steiner, Kerstin Carr, Steve Schoeny, and thanks to all of you for being here. We'll see you next week.